A province the size of a small country is running out of money. Ontario, home to nearly 15 million people, is staring down a deficit of $13.8 billion in the fiscal year running from 2026 to 2027. That number comes directly from Queen's Park's own budget documents, published in March of 2026. And Ontario is not alone. British Columbia has just posted a deficit of $9.6 billion for 2025 to 2026, and projects that number will balloon to $13.3 billion in the coming fiscal year. These figures are from BC's own budget 2026 fiscal plan. 2 provinces. 2 historic deficit records. And the bills are arriving at exactly the wrong moment. What makes these numbers especially jarring is what is driving them. The Ontario Financial Accountability Office released its Winter 2026 Economic and Budget Outlook, and the language is unusually blunt. The office found that Ontario's deficit widened because spending grew by 3.2%, while revenues fell by 1.2%, primarily due to lower non-tax revenues. That is a scissors problem. Costs going up. Income going down. And the blades are still moving. For British Columbia, the credit agency Morningstar DBRS ran a separate calculation and found that on an adjusted basis, BC's 2026 to 2027 shortfall reaches $21.8 billion. That is equivalent to 4.7% of the province's entire gross domestic product. To put that in human terms, BC is spending nearly 5 cents of every dollar of economic output it does not actually have. Governments that borrow to cover daily operations eventually reach a wall. That wall is built brick by brick through service cuts, hiring freezes, and asset sales. And in Canada in mid-2026, that construction is well underway. At the federal level, the Parliamentary Budget Officer released its analysis of the 2026 main estimates and found that direct program spending across many departments and agencies falls by 7.5% for 2026 to 2027. Total operating expenditures drop by 6.3% compared to prior estimates. The federal government's own Comprehensive Expenditure Review, which is an internal restructuring plan, targets savings of $9 billion in 2026 to 2027. That grows to $10 billion in 2027 to 2028 and $13 billion in 2028 to 2029. The machinery of the state is being shrunk by design. The most immediate signal of that shrinkage is visible in the payroll. The federal government's Comprehensive Expenditure Review plan includes a reduction of 16,000 full-time equivalent positions over 3 years. The executive layer of the public service faces a cut of 1,000 positions, with 650 of those already embedded in the review. And the trend is already showing up in the data. A CBC report from June 24 of 2026 found that the federal public service has already lost over 12,000 workers in the past fiscal year alone. The government's official language describes these reductions as being managed, to the greatest extent possible, through voluntary departures. But 12,000 jobs gone in a single year is not a gentle wind down. That is a structural contraction. At the provincial level, the cuts have moved closer to classrooms and community centres. Educators in Ontario school boards began reporting in mid-2026 that layoff notifications were arriving for secretarial staff, child and youth counsellors, educational assistants, and technology specialists. Workers in those roles are being placed on recall lists of up to 2 years, meaning they are neither fully employed nor fully let go. They are in limbo. These are not back-office positions. They are the people who help children manage anxiety in school hallways, who support students with learning disabilities in real time, and who keep administrative systems running. When they disappear, the impact is felt immediately, and it is felt by the most vulnerable people in the system. Nothing illustrates the fiscal squeeze more concretely than what has happened to transit funding. A federal government decision in mid-2026 cut $5 billion from the dedicated municipal transit fund, reducing the 10-year envelope from $30 billion to $25 billion. The transit fund that municipalities had been counting on for capital projects and service expansion is now 20% smaller than planned. The union Unifor issued a statement saying the cut would, and this is a direct quote from their Newswire release, threaten safe, reliable service and push costs onto working people and municipalities already under strain. That is not a political opinion. That is a financial reality. Cities that had planned bus route expansions, subway extensions, or fleet replacements will now have to make different choices. They can raise local fares, cut service, delay capital projects, or go back to already strained property tax bases for more money. Every option has a cost. Think about what public transit actually does in an economic system. It moves workers to their jobs. It moves customers to shops and restaurants. It connects the construction crews who build affordable housing to the sites where they are needed. When transit funding shrinks, the knock-on effects are not abstract. The Ontario FAO data shows that revenue weakness, combined with spending pressure, is compressing the province's fiscal capacity at exactly the moment when demand for services is highest. Lower revenues mean fewer dollars for infrastructure contracts, fewer public sector jobs, and less purchasing power circulating through local economies. The fiscal squeeze feeds directly into a demand squeeze. And a demand squeeze tends to show up first in the data for small businesses, hospitality, and retail, where margins are already thin. The British Columbia government's own budget language acknowledges the tension. BC's Budget 2026 documents describe a policy of making, and this is a direct quote, disciplined choices to protect critical services while responding to economic uncertainty. The province also committed $330 million to stabilize its childcare BC program, which signals that even programs shielded from cuts are now requiring emergency stabilization funding just to stay in place. Stabilization money is not growth money. It is the government spending resources simply to prevent a program from falling backward. When a province is paying to maintain the status quo rather than improve it, that is a quiet admission that the status quo is now at risk. Scotiabank's budget analysis adds one more layer to the Ontario picture. The bank's economists note that while Ontario's fiscal balance technically improved to a deficit of $12.3 billion in the 2025 to 2026 fiscal year, the following year's projection is still $13.8 billion. The deficit is not narrowing. It is widening again before the current plan even finishes. That structural persistence is the real story here. These are not one-year anomalies caused by a single recession or a temporary shock. They are the product of demographic pressure, aging infrastructure, post-pandemic service backlogs, and revenue systems that were not designed to support the level of public services that modern populations expect. So where does this lead? There are three realistic scenarios for the next 2 to 3 years. In the first scenario, fiscal discipline holds and deficits narrow slowly. Governments absorb the political cost of service cuts, public sector unions accept constrained wage settlements, and revenue gradually recovers as economic conditions stabilize. The pain is real, but the trajectory bends back toward balance by 2028 or 2029. This requires both economic recovery and political will that has not yet been demonstrated. In the second scenario, the cuts create their own drag. Fewer public sector workers means less consumer spending. Less consumer spending means lower sales tax revenues. Lower sales tax revenues mean smaller deficits become harder to close. Provinces find themselves in a feedback loop where austerity itself suppresses the growth that would have ended the austerity. This is historically the more common outcome when spending cuts are implemented during a period of existing economic softness. In the third scenario, the federal and provincial governments disagree on who bears the burden. Municipalities that lost transit funding push back hard. Provinces facing school board layoff protests reverse some decisions. The result is a patchwork of partial retreats, partial cuts, and rising debt that satisfies no one. Net debt in Ontario is already forecast to cross $514 billion next year. A patchwork strategy does not stop that clock. The honest assessment, based on the numbers available as of mid-2026, is that Canada's provinces are in the early stages of a multi-year fiscal reckoning. The headline deficit numbers, $13.8 billion in Ontario, $13.3 billion in BC, and the federal government's own $9 billion savings target, suggest that the cuts already announced represent a first wave, not a final adjustment. What comes next depends on how quickly economic conditions recover, whether revenue projections from the spring budgets hold, and how much political tolerance exists for the human cost of the reductions already in motion. 12,000 federal workers already gone. Teachers' aides in Ontario on 2-year recall lists. $25 billion in transit funding instead of $30. The numbers are not a forecast anymore. They are already the present tense. If this documentary gave you a clearer picture of what is happening in Canadian public finances right now, all the primary sources including the Ontario FAO report, the BC Fiscal Plan, the PBO main estimates analysis, and the Federal Expenditure Review are linked in the description below. Read them yourself. The raw numbers are more striking than any script can fully convey. The question worth sitting with is this. When governments at every level are simultaneously cutting, who exactly is positioned to absorb the slack? If you want to follow this story as it develops over the next 2 to 3 years, subscribing means you will be here when the next round of numbers lands. And given the trajectory of these deficits, the next round will not take long.